Let me introduce my guest. He's one of the most eminent historians and, frankly, knowledgeable people that you'll ever see interviewed on television. He's Professor Niall Ferguson, and he joins me now. Professor Niall Ferguson, great to see you. I can't think of a better time to have you on the show, so thank you for joining me. We've got plenty of time to go through all these things. Let me start with COVID. As I'm sitting here with it, this virus which brought the whole world to its knees. Boris Johnson up tomorrow in London in front of an inquiry. What's the point of this inquiry? Many saying it's got 3 or 4 years to run. By then, as William Hague, former leader of the Conservative Party here, wrote in the Times column yesterday, there might have been another pandemic. Should we not be working as a planet on how to prevent another pandemic rather than worrying too much about what happened last time?
Well, Piers, it's good to be with you. I think it's good that there is an attempt to work out what went wrong, what could have been done better. And let me just say that as I'm speaking to you from the United States, the UK is doing more in this respect than the US, because although there have been attempts to have an inquiry into the handling of COVID in the United States, there really is no interest in Washington in doing that. And so the only inquiries have been unofficial ones. I think there's a really important question that needs to be asked by every democracy, particularly in the West, because many Eastern democracies handled COVID quite well. Why did the public health systems do worse than was expected? Prior to the pandemic, Piers, the US and the UK were rated respectively number 1 and number 2 for preparedness in the event of a pandemic. Well, they clearly did not come in first and second in terms of their management of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think there were 2 reasons for that. One was that the experts underestimated initially the seriousness of the problem. Even although it was clear that a pandemic was brewing in January of 2020, I remember making the argument that it was brewing in a column in January in the Sunday Times. The experts actually dithered in January and February and into March. And the public health bureaucracies were woefully unready when it became clear belatedly how big the problem was. The second issue, which I think is less important, has to do with leadership. At the time, and still, there's a great deal of criticism of Boris Johnson and of Donald Trump. And I think it's fair to say that they didn't do particularly well, but I don't think they were the real reason why excess mortality was so high in the UK and the US. So I hope that the conclusion of this inquiry is not that it was all Boris's fault, because I think that would be to miss the much more important point that the public health bureaucracies, and not only in the UK, also in the US and in many other countries, really underperformed.
Are we prepared for another pandemic to hit us, do you think? I mean, there's been a lot of navel-gazing about individual countries' performance, league tables, and so on. But if there was to be another one next week, next month, next year, I mean, apparently there's a 25% chance, according to the experts, there might be one in the next 5 years. Do you think we're ready for that to happen? Are we better prepared now?
Well, I would hope so. One reason that countries such as Taiwan and South Korea handled COVID much better than the UK and the US was that they had learnt the lessons from SARS, which was really the trailer for COVID-19. And the countries in the West really hadn't, because they thought, not having been much affected by SARS, that they should just worry about the next influenza pandemic. So I'm hoping that there is a realization that you don't get the pandemic you're expecting necessarily. But we can't really be sure if, for example, we would react more quickly to a new outbreak of a new disease. Remember, in some ways, the virus that caused COVID-19 was not an especially disastrous one by the standards of plagues in the past, because it disproportionately killed the elderly. Imagine a virus that was as likely to kill the very young as the very old, or to kill people in the prime of life. That was a much more common feature of pandemics in the past. And really, if you look at the infection mortality rate and then you adjust for age, for the number of days of life lost, then COVID-19 wasn't by any means one of the world's worst pandemics. Are we ready for something as bad as, say, the 1918-19 influenza? I can't tell you that, Piers. The only consolation that I can offer your viewers is that we did at least learn in 2020 how to produce efficacious vaccines very quickly. And although there continues to be controversy about the vaccines, I'm one of those people who believes they played a vital role in limiting mortality, and they were the great success story on both sides of the Atlantic. And so, if nothing else, the most important thing in a pandemic is to get vaccines that work and get them quickly. So we at least proved that we can do that. And that was the one really good piece of news that came out of 2020.
Yeah, and I would give credit to Boris Johnson for his work with that, unquestionably. Let me talk to, before we get to Israel, Gaza, which is obviously the biggest news story in the world at the moment, let me just talk to you about this issue of immigration in the UK. Another big plan announced by the UK government, by another Home Secretary. I think it's the fifth we've had. It was the third Home Secretary to go to Rwanda since they vowed to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. And so far, no asylum seekers have gone to Rwanda. But there's also a wider problem here, not just of legal migration, illegal migration, but also legal migration. And it's affecting the whole continent of Europe and indeed wider parts of the world. What's your assessment of how we should deal with this new world of millions of people wanting to move to, in their eyes, a better place?
Well, we do indeed, Piers, live in an age of mass migration, though it's not the first in history. If you look at the flows relative to population, they were comparably huge in the late 19th century. I'm myself an immigrant. I'm an immigrant to the United States. You might say I also was an immigrant to England from Scotland once upon a time. And I'm married to an asylum seeker. My wife, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, sought asylum in the Netherlands. And so we as a family are hardly likely to be hardline opponents of immigration. That would be immense hypocrisy. I think there are a couple of really important points that are worth making here. The first is that if there's a sudden swing in net migration, if you suddenly go from relatively little to a lot, to hundreds of thousands in the case of a country like the UK, you would expect there to be some kind of public backlash. And if anything, to me, the surprising thing about the UK today is that the public's been so tolerant of an extraordinary surge in net migration, which is certainly not, I think, what people expected to be one of the consequences of voting for Brexit. The interesting thing is that if you look at opinion polling, there's no real evidence of racism, of xenophobia. When British people complain about excessively large net migration, they're just complaining about the impact on public services, the kind of services like the NHS that come under strain when there are suddenly hundreds of thousands more people to serve. So I think one lesson of recent years is that one mustn't allow there to be such big shifts, because while immigration is, I think, a necessary part of the way the world works, especially a world of aging populations in many developed countries, it's important to recognize that people shouldn't expect it to come in great surges. The second point is that I think you need to have a clear and coherent policy that the public understands. And I think at the moment in Britain, there's the very opposite. There's really considerable confusion. And I must say the swings in policy, as you mentioned, the regular changes in policy, the somewhat outlandish notion that people whose asylum cases are questioned will be sent to Rwanda, none of this has inspired public confidence, rather the opposite. And one must wonder why the Prime Minister would sack a Home Secretary who'd called for more restrictions and then just within a matter of days introduce new restrictions of the sort that I think Suella Braverman had called for. So this is calculated to confuse and disorient the public. As I said, the impressive thing to me is that the British public's remarkably tolerant. I sometimes read in the New York Times that Brexit was motivated by imperial nostalgia or Little Englandism. Turns out to be quite untrue. One of the least predicted consequences of Brexit was that migration into the UK shifted from being plumbers from Poland to being people from outside the European Union, from as far afield as Hong Kong and other parts of Asia, as well as North Africa. And British people are remarkably tolerant of this. In fact, in many ways, I think they even welcome it when it helps keep the NHS working. So the key issue in Britain, I think, is that there are public services under strain, especially in the southeast. Housing, of course, is a huge problem even without immigration in the southeast. And to me, the only surprising thing is that people aren't more indignant about this. Look at the Netherlands, to make one final point. In many European countries, this issue is causing earthquakes in the political landscape. New parties surging into positions of power. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany. And what happens in Britain? Well, nothing much really happens because it's still a two-party system. And the arguments go on within the Conservative Party and within the Labour Party almost exactly as they did when we were kids, Piers, back in the 1960s and 70s.
Mm. And, you know, it's one of the reasons I've been so incensed about this whole Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Oprah Winfrey racism row, is that it painted this country as a hotbed of white supremacists and racists right from the very top with our royal family, when in fact, all the evidence points to the complete contrary, that we are arguably one of the most tolerant countries in the world.
I agree with that, Piers. And in fact, if you look at the data, survey data and data on behaviour, I think you could make a very convincing case that the United Kingdom is the most tolerant country in the world. And I always like to explain to Americans, you know, the thing about the English is that they really care a lot more about class than they do about race. I say this semi-jokingly. Actually, if you look at the data, Piers, it's very striking how much wider the disparities are in terms of income and quality of life between white and black Americans as compared with their British counterparts. And I would say one of the most striking features of our lifetimes has been Britain's transformation from an overwhelmingly white society into one that, particularly in the South, but not only in the South, also in the Midlands, is really extraordinarily ethnically and religiously diverse. And one might have said, as Enoch Powell, of course, did in the late 1960s, this will lead to terrible trouble. There'll be blood in the streets or in the River Tiber, as he said in his famous speech. And that hasn't been the case. Enoch Powell was actually wrong. Britain's accepted this very enormous change in its social aspect with remarkably little friction, in my view.